Nüüd on meil suurepärane võimalus siis kuulata sellise organisatsiooni nagu BBC praktikat. Mina olen BBC fänn, ma tean, mulle väga meeldib see, mida BBC teeb. Minu meelest on ka organisatsioonina nad ma arvan, et ka brändina ülemaailmselt tõesti väga-väga tuntud. Ja sellepärast ongi meil nüüd väga hea meel koostöös Ühendkuningriigi saatkonnaga kuulata ja ma saan aru ka natuke vaadata BBC praktikaid ja tegevust mitmekesisuse juhtimisel, väärtustamisel, teadvustamisel. Ja meil on siin Amanda Rice, kes täpselt seda teemat BBC-s juhib ja edendab. Nii et, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, hello everybody. I understood the words BBC fan there, so that was good, a good start anyway. So hello, and thank you first of all to the organisers for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to be here at the signing of Estonia's Diversity Charter. A little bit about me first of all. I've worked for the BBC for about 6 years, and for about 3.5 of those I've been heading up the diversity functions, head of diversity. The diversity function is a small central team. We're located in the HR division of the BBC, but our remit goes way beyond employment and workforce, so we're responsible for providing advice and guidance in relation to diversity matters, certainly across employment, but also in relation to our output, the programmes we make, our audiences, and also in our strategic and business planning processes. So today I'm going to talk about the BBC's overall approach to delivering equality and diversity. I am going to focus in on employment, but I am also going to talk a little bit about why we consider equality and diversity in our service delivery, in the programmes we make, because I believe the two things are inextricably linked. Who we employ and how we employ them ultimately influences the services we deliver, the programmes we make. So first of all, just a little bit of general background about the BBC. It was established by Royal Charter in 1922, so we've been around a long time. It is uniquely funded by a universal licence fee, which I think is a different model to the public service broadcaster here in Estonia, I understand. We have a public purpose remit to educate, to entertain and to inform. And there is a board of trustees known as the BBC Trust, who are there for two functions really. One, to protect the editorial independence of the BBC, which is absolutely sacrosanct, but also to oversee the work of the BBC executive on behalf of the licence fee payers, on behalf of our paying public. So they really regulate what the BBC executive gets up to. In terms of the size and scope of the organisation and what we deliver, we provide services, deliver services which reach around 97% of media users, media consumers in the UK. In fact, I think it's around 175 million times a day somebody turns on or over to BBC services across the world, whether that's UK, whether that's online, television or radio. We have 10 national TV channels, 4 big ones and then some lesser ones, and then a range of regional television as well. We have 10 radio networks and a number of regional smaller networks as well. And then we've got online services, the BBC iPlayer, which is our catch-up service. Of course, there's BBC Worldwide, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then we have the, BBC World Service, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then we also have BBC Worldwide, which is our commercial arm. So a very, very big and diverse organisation. In terms of our employment, we employ in the region of about 20,000 staff. And to give you an idea of the employee brand, the popularity of the employee brand, we receive around 50,000 applications for jobs every year for probably about 600 or 700 jobs. So a lot of people wanting to work for the organisation. Before I say any more, I'm just going to show you a short show reel, which is literally hot off the press. It's something we've developed internally to be able to show people a little bit about some of the work we do, but through our output. So it's a show reel showing some of our more recent output in our programmes. It is in English. We would normally subtitle this. All of our show reels are subtitled, but as this was literally finished last week, we haven't actually got the subtitling up there yet. However, it will give you an example of some of our recent output and what we're trying to do, building diversity into our programmes.
As a viewer of the BBC, I find it really important the BBC connects with my life. I'm a Zoroastrian. I have a family that has got Chinese, Indian, African, Middle Eastern, Australian and American people in it. We all live here, we feel British.
The question had been asked, could Team GB deliver? They had delivered beyond expectation, out of this world.
So we've got 4 generations here.
Yes, yes.
That's incredible.
1, 2, 3, 4.
You're the mixed-race family, really, aren't you?
I knew then that I was, but I was like kind of denying it. I think probably when you said you were being teased at school for being a lesbian, I wondered then. But you were so indignant that you weren't. I thought, okay, maybe not.
Our job in BBC News is to provide really broad range of news services for all our audiences. And certainly in the UK, that means making sure that we reflect all the licence fee paying public.
The Olympic protest that electrified the world, the Black Power salute from 1968. Ahead of our own games, we hear from the man on the podium making a profound political point, Tommy Smith.
You know, being able to come home and watch myself on TV, it's like, you know, that's me. Years ago, I'd never even be thinking about doing anything like that.
AC-12 have been trying to stick me for weeks, son. If you think you can do better, be my guest.
Say to him, I don't want to be a carer.
Do you say it? You say it to Malcolm.
I do say it to Malcolm.
Does that upset him?
I told her.
Did you tell her?
Yes, she needs a rest.
A big part of our job is to provide drama for all of the audiences. The way that I do that is try to work with the broadest range of writers who I believe will bring their different ways of thinking to the screen.
We think of ancient Rome as all white marble columns and classical order. But actually, it was a chaotic place. rambling and dirty. It was a right mess.
My impression of Islam sat within post 9/11 thinking and the emphasis around fanaticism. But finding out about Marmaduke changed all that. Suddenly, Islam became so much more.
I think I've upset you a little bit, haven't I?
Oh, yeah.
Shall I tell you why? I've upset you, but not them.
Yeah, go on, yeah.
It's because they're confident about their sexuality, darling. They don't have to kick off to prove they're men.
I genuinely get very excited when you feel that a piece of content, whether it's a drama, a documentary, a news item, a religious program, a science program, when you feel it touching and connecting with lots of people. I think one of the real privileges of broadcasting is you can still reach so many millions of people with one program.
Okay, so I hope that gave you a flavour of some of our output, and I'm sorry, I think it was running slightly more slowly, which perhaps was helpful with the translation, actually, but I know there's something technical there, it was slightly slower than it should have done, but to give you just a flavour of the breadth of our output, and also some of our senior leaders there speaking about why diversity is important to them, both personally and professional, which I think is really, really important to have that leadership. So first of all, why diversity for the BBC? Well, we have a clear business case. Really, for us, it's the creative case. Considering and reflecting diversity enhances and helps to drive creativity. And then, above all else, it's about our audiences, needing to connect with our many diverse audiences. We operate in an increasingly complex environment. As I'm sure here in Estonia, there's a fragmenting and competitive marketplace, rapid technological change, significant demographic social change. We talked about the ageing population earlier. We've had the UK, we're waiting for the UK census results, which will be showing how the UK is changing in terms of a whole range of demographics. And then audience behaviours are changing because of all of those factors and patterns of media consumption. So it's absolutely critical for us to connect with our audiences and to give our audiences and our future audiences what they need and expect from the BBC. And to do that, we need to be able to understand our audiences and understand their diversity. Secondly, as a public service broadcaster, we have a duty to make sure that we deliver something of value to everyone who pays for us. As I've said, there's a universal licence fee. I mean, we also need to make sure that there's universal access to our services. So we need to think really hard about how people are accessing the programs we make. So for disabled people, for example, how can people with perhaps sensory impairments access our services? We also need to think about a plurality, reflecting a plurality of views and opinions, a diversity of voices across our whole content, but in particular across our news and current affairs output, whilst at the same time remaining impartial and balanced. And then there are our underserved audiences. It's a duty for us to make sure that we reach those audiences who we know are less well served by the BBC. And we know who these audiences are. We do a lot of research, we look at data, we work with audiences. We know that audiences from minority ethnic backgrounds, we know that audiences from from more disadvantaged backgrounds and lower socioeconomic groups, and also young people, are less likely to use our services and to appreciate our services. So it's very, very important that we find ways to connect with those specific audiences and understand them. And we need to do that. We need to make programs that are relevant to their lives, programs that when they turn on the television or they turn on the radio, they see themselves or people like them reflected. They see their localities, they hear people speaking like them, they hear about things that are of interest to them and their lives. To be able to do that effectively, we need to make sure that we're reflecting diversity on screen and air. So one of our newsreaders there, a female, we're doing a lot at the moment to make sure that we're reflecting across our news and current affairs all diversity, but with a real focus on gender, because that's one of the things. There's a lot in the press at the moment about the media not reflecting or not representing women across certain programs as much as men. So we're doing a lot of work to try and make sure that there's equal representation of women on our news and current affairs programs in particular, and of course other areas of diversity. So very, very important to reflect the diversity on screen, and we need to get it right as well. So it's no good just having stereotypical or tokenistic portrayal. Our audiences are savvy. They know when something is right. They know when something is meaningful to them and connects to them. We need to make sure that our portrayal, representation of different groups is authentic and is accurate. And to do that, it's important that we also reflect diversity off-screen, so in our wider workforce. So people behind the cameras, behind the microphones, but also our employees who have nothing to do with actually, you know, the industry of program making, the people who work in the offices, all the people who support from afar, people like me, for example, the work of the BBC. If we have a diverse workforce, we know that we will have greater creativity, and our output will be more diverse. We know that we will connect better with our audiences, our diverse audiences, and of course we know that we will have a greater talent pool from which to draw creative ideas and input. So with regard to employment, as a public sector broadcaster, we are actually required to promote equality across our employment and enhance the diversity of our staff. But as I've said, we would do that anyway. The business case is absolutely clear. It enhances creativity. It means that we can connect with our audiences better, and we have that wider talent pool. In addition to our clear business case and our duties as a public service broadcaster, there's also UK equalities legislation. We have a robust framework in place which drives much of our work. In addition to specific employment regulations in the UK, the Equality Act 2010 introduced a duty on all public bodies, and of course the BBC is a public body, publicly funded, to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation, to advance equality of opportunity, not just promote but advance, proactively advance it, and to foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic, that's the terminology of the legislation, and those who do not. And by protected characteristic, or those who share protected characteristics, we're talking about diverse groups in effect, and there are 9 groups that are covered by this legislation, so really, really broad in scope. And in addition to those groups, the BBC also recognises diversity in terms of socioeconomic background, which is not covered by the legislation, and also in terms of regionality. It's really important for the BBC to connect with and relate to and reflect the diversity around the UK, because we are a UK-wide broadcaster. The duty to eliminate discrimination, advance equality of opportunity, etc., applies to all of the BBC's functions and activities, apart from our programme making activities. And some people kind of say, oh, well, that's a surprise. The reason for that is to protect our editorial independence. but all other functions and activities, so our employment function, our procurement functions, our strategic and financial decision-making, big strategic functions, are all covered by this duty. So it really has had a significant impact on the way we operate as both an employer and a service provider. What it means in practice is that we now need to, and we have been for some time, consult regularly with our service users, our audiences, and with our employees to find out what they think about how we're doing around equality and diversity, to listen to them. We need to set specific and measurable objectives, and we need to publish those objectives and be absolutely transparent about what they are and how we aim to meet those objectives. And we need to publish a whole raft of equalities information each year, which we do now in an annual report. We're just gathering information at the moment for our second annual report, which shows how we've put actions into place, which I'll come on to in a moment, to meet those objectives. And then we also need to think about ways of continually assessing our policies and our decision-making. And obviously, employment policies and decision-making around our workforce is a key part of that, but it also extends to our other functions and activities, such as, for example, procurement. So we need to think whenever we're creating a policy or reviewing a policy or making a key strategic decision, we need to look at it with an equalities lens and think, okay, if we take that course of action, what is the likely impact going to be on various diverse groups? Is there going to be a differential negative impact, or perhaps a positive impact, an opportunity to enhance equality and diversity if we take that course of action? And if we identify that there may be a potentially negative impact, we have to be very, very clear why we still go down that route, or we have to find mitigating ways to mitigate that potential negative impact. So quite a sort of consistent and systematic process of looking at all our key decision-making practices. And it's something we're working on. We do it pretty well across employment. We're doing it increasingly across our procurement practices, but there are other areas where the organisation is getting used to using these sort of systems. So, how did we actually, or how have we actually gone about assessing what needs to be done and then doing it? How have we assessed what are the gaps and the barriers are in our practices and thought about how to address those? Well, the BBC has led in the area of equality and diversity for many years in the media and broadcast sector. In fact, we had our first Equal Opportunities Officer in place, I think it was in 1987, so a long, long time ago. And the big focus then was on gender equality. That's how it all started, a really big focus that went on for many years. And since then, that's grown. Our understanding of diversity has grown, thinking much more in recent years about ethnic diversity, about disabled people, and more recently about other areas of diversity as well, much broader. As I said, we think now a lot about socioeconomic diversity and the backgrounds, social backgrounds that people come from to work for us. But I just want to talk for a little while about some of the work we've been doing over perhaps the last 3 years, in part driven by our preparation for the new legislation in the UK. Because what we've aimed to do is introduce a more strategic approach and framework to how we work around equality and diversity. And actually listening to what was being said this morning about establishing the charter, I think some of those things that I can see as similarity in the way that we've tried to work within the BBC, getting a framework into place that people can then work with. So, in effect, this has allowed us to assess and report on our progress, and that's useful because we are able to then capture and highlight where parts of the organisation are doing some really great work, which perhaps other parts of the organisation, we're very big, didn't know about. So we can capture that work and we can share that across the organisation. So to assess and report on our progress, to identify where there are issues and concerns more easily and then take action to address those, and obviously to make sure that we comply with the relevant legislation and our public service, our duties as a public service broadcaster. So, in 2010, we consulted very widely with all of our audiences and also with our employees. So we used an online survey for audiences and employees. We used focus groups, deliberative workshops all around the UK, one-to-one interviews to get an understanding of how they thought the BBC was doing around equality and diversity generally in relation to our employment practice and also in relation to our service delivery. And it was from this, from the findings from that work, informed our strategy. So we have a strategy now in place that was developed in 2011 and published, which everyone has a story. And this has established a clear vision and direction, and within that there are 5 key objectives around our workforce, diversifying the workforce, and particularly our senior leadership, around our output, the way we work with audiences, particularly underserved audiences, around accessibility for disabled people, both employees and our audiences, and also around our strategic decision-making processes. So how do we actually measure our progress and what happens on the ground? Well, every department in the BBC, or we call them BBC divisions and regions, has to develop an annual action plan. We call it a diversity action plan, and that's based on those 5 core objectives. So that the actions are relevant to those local areas, to those divisions or to those regions, but they all work towards meeting the 5 corporate objectives. Progress is monitored and reported quarterly to a senior level diversity board where most of our executive directors sit around the table, and that's chaired by the Director General. And then we report annually to the Trust, and all of that information is published. So I think someone I think it was Ingrid who was saying earlier about you know, when information is made public, it's a jolly good way to encourage people, if they see perhaps they're not doing quite as well as another part of the BBC, to do that little bit better. And also it means that everybody can have a look and see what other areas are doing and learn from those action plans, including, of course, our audiences and licence fee payers. So individual departments decide on their own activities and do it their way, which is important in a large and very diverse creative organisation. It's very important that we're not too prescriptive. People know what our corporate objectives are and they find ways locally to try and meet those. But what we have in place now is a framework for systematic and consistent action planning, monitoring and review, a clear corporate governance and accountability structure, and clear loud leadership, and I believe all 3 of those are absolutely essential to achieving progress and to seeing tangible outcomes. And again, I think it was I think that was mentioned this morning, the importance of having senior leadership talk about these things. So in relation to the employment objectives specifically, to increase staff diversity and particularly at senior manager levels, well, that aspiration is not new. That's been in place for quite some time, though the focus has changed somewhat over the years. We monitor the diversity of our staff and have done for many years in relation to age, gender, ethnicity, disability, and we've recently, in the last couple of years, also introduced sexual orientation monitoring and monitoring for faith belief. Monitoring is voluntary. People are asked to identify when they join the organisation, but we do actually have a very high return rate. And then every 2 to 3 years, we also run what we call an internal staff census, just to update our figures. We ran one last year, and we got a 54% return rate, which compared to other organisations is pretty good, particularly considering it's a voluntary census. We've had targets in place for some years, and there's been some interesting discussion already today about quotas and targets and the pros and cons of those. But I must be clear, these are not quotas, as Ingrid was saying this morning. These are targets, aspirational targets, to help focus the mind and to get different areas to think about where they need to do better in terms of diversity. So we've had targets in place for black and minority ethnic representation and disabled representation of staff for a number of years, and they've undoubtedly helped us to move forward in terms of our minority ethnic representation. We're pretty well at the target we set ourselves for the end of 2012, just a tiny little bit off, but pretty well there, which is great. But the really important thing is the regular monitoring of those helps us to see where there are issues. And we know at the moment we have a challenge with disability representation. It's actually dropped over the last about 2 or 3 years. We were at 4.6% and we're now at about 3.7%. So to address that, or to try to address that and explore what's happening, we've done some targeted work this year, working with disabled staff within the organisation, those who have identified as disabled, working with our disabled staff forum, working with various disability organisations externally to try and understand and unpick what's going on here. Are there more disabled people leaving the organisation than joining? Well, actually looking at our data, we found that's not the case. I think we do have an issue of disabled people within the BBC choosing, some of them choosing not to declare, whereas previously more were declaring, and that in itself throws up some questions as to why that may be. So we've done quite a lot of targeted work, and we're just pulling together the findings from that, and we're going to be, from that, making some recommendations as to what we can do to try and reverse that trend. So in that sense, target's very, very useful to focus the mind and to flag up where there are issues. But they're not the be-all and end-all. They're only a management tool, and I think focusing overly on targets sometimes can be unhelpful. It's much more important for managers to think about how they create an inclusive working environment locally, how they make sure that they retain their diverse staff and develop their diverse staff, so ultimately we will have more diverse senior managers. I should also say that we're just at the point of reviewing our targets, and we're going to be introducing gender targets for specific areas where we know gender representation is low. So in technology and engineering areas, female representation is low, around 27%. We want to bring that right up. In other areas, it's higher. In fact, in some areas, it's higher than male representation, so we're not applying targets there. So we're taking a more nuanced, a more sophisticated approach to where we have targets rather than just one overall figure for the whole organisation. Just to say a few words about identifying barriers to access. And here I'm going to talk about access in the broader sense in relation to access to opportunities for all groups. Though I should say that specifically in relation to access for disabled staff, that's a very, very important element of our work, and we have various programs and initiatives and funding available to make sure that we can put in place the reasonable adjustments that some disabled staff may need. So a lot of work going on there, and one of our senior executives acts as a disability champion. In fact, it was the lady who spoke at the beginning of our film, and that's done a lot to really raise interest in disability and the focus of it in the organisation. But coming back to broader barriers to accessing opportunities, as I've just said, I think it's really important not just to think about attraction and recruitment of diverse groups into the organisation. Retention, obviously, is a critical issue, and the BBC, as for many other organisations, has an issue or challenge, I should say, with diversity at more senior levels. Retaining diverse talent and identifying who can be our future leaders from that diverse pool is incredibly important. The various barriers to achieving diversity right across the broadcast media sector, and I think also many of these apply to other sectors and other professions, certainly within the UK, and I would imagine elsewhere as well, are well documented. Perceptions of the industry as only tending to employ one type of person, generally speaking, a university educated, white, middle class. That's a perception that we're really trying to break down, but nevertheless it is there. Feedback we've had, not just the BBC, but right across the media sector, that the entry routes are often very difficult to navigate, somewhat opaque. These kind of things, these kind of challenges, we've really had to work hard at trying to address. If they're difficult to navigate for certain groups, then they're going to be even more difficult to navigate for people who perhaps come from more diverse and marginalised backgrounds. There are certain practices that have been popular across the media sector and other professions, such as internships, so where somebody will come into work perhaps for a year as an intern to get a foot in the door, to make networks, to get some work experience, but they're not paid for it, unpaid internships. We don't do that at the BBC anymore and haven't done for some time, because if there's one thing that makes sure that you're not going to get diverse entrants coming into your organisation, it's unpaid internships. The people who can come and do those unpaid internships or work experience are going to be people from fairly privileged backgrounds whose parents, they're usually young people, can afford to pay for them to work for free for 1 year. That means that people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, many of whom, of course, in the UK, are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds as well, or people who are disabled and or don't have haven't had a great deal of income up to this point, can't afford to come in and do this. So it's sort of unpicking some of those things and making sure that the sector as a whole doesn't continue to use those sorts of practices. And then for the media sector, there's just the nature of commissioning and production of programmes itself. Very often a budget for a programme will be given at the last minute, and then everybody is in a mad rush looking for staff to work on their programmes, to crew up for their programmes. The tendency is, right across the sector, for people to go to their little black book and just bring in the people that they've known have worked for them before. It's quicker, it's easier, they trust them. But what it does do means that it doesn't give opportunities to that diverse talent pool that's out there who need to have the opportunities and get the foot in the door. And then lastly, I would mention unconscious bias. There's an increasing recognition that we all have our unconscious bias in the decisions we make, and not just in recruitment decisions, in all sorts of decisions that one would make or a manager might make in an organisation. And it's really important to think about how that works in an organisational context. So in recruitment, very typically, the recruiting in one's own image. One is naturally drawn to people that you feel akin to, that you might recognise as someone a bit like you in some way, and that unconscious bias can come into play and can flavour and influence all sorts of decisions, which can then work against broader diversity. So we're doing quite a lot of work internally looking at unconscious bias and discussing with managers how that can play out in an organisational context. And there are a number of organisations in the UK that are looking at that now increasingly. In terms of, I'm just going to check the time here. Okay, in terms of improving access and opportunities to a wider group, we've got a range of initiatives and programmes in place and have had for some time. So, for example, we have a programme called Extend, which brings talented disabled people into the organisation as paid to get experience in a whole host of different roles for a period of 6 months. That's been in place for 14 years now, so it's quite a flagship programme. And the transference rate of people from that programme into paid work in the BBC is at around 60 to 65%. So doing pretty well in terms of people, disabled people, actually then getting paid work in the BBC. There are two fairly prestigious schemes, entry routes into the BBC, called the Journalism Trainee Scheme and the Production Trainee Scheme. And these are like sort of fast-track schemes for trainees to come in and get experience either in journalism or production across a whole range of areas. And more often than not, people who have been on those schemes go on to quite high-flying careers within the industry. A couple of our Director Generals came through on those schemes. So very, very popular schemes to get into. We're conscious that in our journalism trainee scheme, we've done quite well to increase the diversity, the ethnic diversity of people coming onto those schemes, not so well in terms of disability. Gender balance is very good on both. The production trainee scheme, we've not been doing so well. So this year we introduced monitoring for all applicants for socioeconomic background to try and get an understanding of who's applying for the schemes, what are their backgrounds, where do they come from, diversity in a whole range of factors, but social diversity specifically, and then how likely are they to then jump over the hoops, as it were, to get into this scheme, to look and see where the fall-offs may be and to see if there's anything about our recruitment practices onto those specific schemes that's actually working against people from more diverse backgrounds coming in and getting a place on those schemes. I mentioned women in engineering technology earlier, so as well as introducing targets in that area, we've done a whole programme of events this year where we've had senior female role models working in these areas, talking to young women and girls from schools, networking events, generally trying to raise awareness about the opportunities in the BBC and the wider industry in engineering and technology for women. And this is something we're not going to see a difference immediately. It's going to take some time, but hopefully we will see a difference. Just a couple of words, I'm conscious of time, on benefits of partnerships with other organisations. We've worked in partnership with local councils for the last couple of years, setting up apprenticeship schemes and work experience schemes to target people specifically from less privileged backgrounds, from more disadvantaged backgrounds, many of whom are from minority ethnic backgrounds as well. And this has worked incredibly well. I mean, we've been getting sort of 60 to 80% representation from minority ethnic backgrounds. Pretty well everyone in the scheme is from some sort of, the kind of background that perhaps where people feel that the BBC or the media industry is not the place for them, have thought that's been their perception, and now being brought into the organisation and understanding that actually there are lots of opportunities. It works well as a partnership because the local councils do the screening, they find the people from their localities, and then they come to us, they go through a second recruitment process, and then they start working for us. So it's been a fantastic benefit for those local councils in getting young, not actually all young, we have an age range, but getting people who have been out of work, into a training programme, hopefully that will then turn into work. We're getting about a 20% transference rate into paid work, and it's been great for us because it's brought in this incredible pool of diverse talent, fascinating young people, the kind of people that we're trying to connect with through our programmes, who can come in and work with us and ultimately help to influence and shape the programme and the output we make. We also work with a network of broadcasters in the UK to put on various events. We put on an event looking at mental health this year, how to manage mental health and non-visible disabilities in the workplace, and also how is mental health portrayed in news and current affairs? What are the sensitivities? What's the kind of language you use? 1 in 4 people in the UK will be touched by some sort of mental health issue in their lives. It accounts for nearly 50% of our absenteeism from work, so a really, really important issue. We also do a lot of work with university schools and community groups, outreach work. Very, very quickly, clear pathways are essential. I mentioned earlier that there's a perception that the media industry is hard to navigate. We did work last year and invested in a new careers website where everything is brought together into one shop window. You can see jobs, work experience, apprenticeships, trainee schemes, volunteering experience, all in one place. We have people on that site, diverse employees, talking about their experience of working for the BBC at all levels, senior and right down to the lowest levels, and giving tips on what it's like to work there and how to get into the organisation, CV tips, interview tips, that sort of thing as well. Improving representation, I spoke earlier about the importance of having that diverse representation on screen to connect with our audiences. It's also really important to make sure that we're sending signals to our potential employee base out there that we want diverse people working for us on screen and off. So we have, again, various programmes in place to increase diversity on screen. Disability is a big focus. We've got a scheme running at the moment, training up 10 potential disabled presenters that we hope at the end of their training we will start to see regularly on our screens. We've got a writer's room that develops diverse writing talent, so we can see that diverse ideas and thoughts coming through in our programmes and our continuing dramas, for example. And lastly, I talked about how did we assess the gap, how did we assess what needed to be done, and then work to close that gap and address some of the areas that we knew were challenges. In In terms of closing the gap, just some final thoughts really to share that might be useful. And I think I've heard already this morning some of these thoughts reflected already. First of all, really important to know your staff and to know your customers or clients for the BBC, our audiences. Understand their profile, do your research, understand your staff and customers. Assess where you are and what you want to achieve, and don't expect to do too much too soon. 2 or 3 key clear objectives. Establish a strategic framework. I mean, obviously with the charter, that's fantastic. That is a framework that you've got in place and can work with that, establishing action plans that you can monitor and review. And also understand the cultural and social factors that may be in play in terms of the organisation and wider society. So thinking about that whole concept of unconscious bias and how it plays out in organisations. Diverse senior role models are absolutely essential. More diverse thought leadership from our leaders, I think, is really, really vital and gives such a clear signal. And consult and involve your staff in this journey. So we have staff forums in the BBC, one for lesbian, gay and bisexual staff, one for black and minority ethnic staff, and one for disabled staff, and they're incredibly helpful to us in shaping our policies and strategies around diversity. Establish partnerships. The more you can work together, share ideas, share resources, really helpful. Think about the sustainability of your work. If you're putting initiatives or programs into place, how easily will you be able to sustain those? And most of all, just remember, you're in for the long game. It's not there's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet. It really is long-term planning, but short disciplined steps does lead to change over a period of time. Thank you. I'm sorry I overran a little bit.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much, Amanda. And now we have questions, and I see there at the back, do we have the microphone? Marianne.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, you do all this work and you see the benefits, but have you measured somehow the benefits of this diversity? Have you said that you started with the gender issues, so was it successful? Did the audience increase, the number of audience, or how did you measure the success?
That's a very good question, and because of the constraints of time, I couldn't talk about all of the work that we do with audiences. So that's a big part of our work, to understand how our audiences respond to the kind of initiatives we put into place. We do a lot of audience research, broad audience research, but also specific pieces of research with diverse audience groups. So last year we did research looking at the portrayal of older people, well actually not just older people, looking at the portrayal of age right across the age range, but we spoke to younger people, people of middle age and older people as well, to get an understanding of how those audiences felt we were doing in terms of portraying age. And out of that, one of the things that came out, which wasn't unexpected, was that older women, for example, are seen as not being as well represented on screen, actually right across the media, as older men or younger women, in fact. So it's that sort of research that then helps to inform the work we will carry out going forward in relation to representation on screen, but also in relation to employment. Yes, we can absolutely see the differences. So back in the 90s and into the 2000s, a lot of work around gender diversity, and we really saw the numbers go up in terms of women moving forward into more senior management positions and in certain specific work areas. And now we're looking again and can see that actually technology and engineering are some areas that we need to go back and look at again. But it certainly made a difference internally at that time, and we have about 37% representation women at senior manager level, pretty well 50% across the organisation. But it's lumpy. In some areas, it's for senior managers, it's high. In other areas, not so high. So we're taking a more targeted effect. But in terms of being able to measure, yes, we can, both in terms of audiences and employees.
Thank you.
Hello.
Another question from the corner there. So next, please, you work with your questions, and then we'll have this part of the room. So.
Good afternoon. I'm First Counselor of the Turkish Embassy here in Tallinn. And I would like to ask a question about gender issues. People talk a lot nowadays about positive discrimination, especially for women who are working, because they have to hold 3 jobs, most of them at the same time. Since they have to be good at their jobs, they have to be good housewives, then they have to be good mothers. And when I mean positive discrimination, I mean sometimes less working hours, longer vacation periods, and also maybe more pay, because they need to hire somebody to help them with the household chores and then, you know, or with the children. So what do you think about this?
Okay, well, I mean, from our perspective, for start, positive discrimination in the UK is unlawful. Positive action we can certainly use, so targeted work and programs, initiatives to encourage more women to come in, for example, to come into the workplace, or indeed any other group. In terms of positive discrimination in that sense, I mean, certainly in the BBC we have very, very flexible working practices. So we look at what can help our employees to do the best they possibly can, whether they are women or in some cases men, perhaps bringing up families as well, being the primary carers. Most often we know that a lot of caring responsibilities will fall to women. So we've got a lot of flexible working practices, and everybody has the right to request flexible working. And generally speaking, the feedback we get from our employees is that they are happy with the practices we've put in place to try and encourage, to try and support them in the ways that they need to work, whether that's job sharing or working from home more hours or those sorts of things. In terms of some of the other things you mentioned, I think that's more of a sort of governmental issue than an organisational issue, but we do as much as we can internally to support people to work in the way that's going to make them the most productive and the least stressed ultimately.
Thank you. Any more questions from this side? Katrin?
Yeah, I was wondering when you mentioned declarations. So I understand it, people have to declare themselves if they have a disability or religion.
Yes.
And you said that the percentage has gone down, and I was thinking, couldn't this actually be a positive thing? Because maybe you feel you don't need to declare if you feel you may have something that may be in some ways regarded as a disability, but it's actually not an issue. So are you sure that it's actually a change physically, or is it the change of the attitude?
Exactly, and that's exactly what our piece of work, our project this year has been to try and unpick. So talking to disabled staff, running focus groups, talking to non-disabled staff as well, or staff who have chosen not to declare, but we tried to make sure that we got people interested to join this piece of work who hadn't declared, but who others might describe as disabled, but they hadn't declared themselves, so didn't identify as disabled, because we wanted to understand exactly that. Was it necessarily a negative thing? Yes, in some cases it could absolutely be a positive thing, and we've had quite interesting feedback and discussions around that. I know that in the UK more broadly, at the moment there's reports, particularly in the press, around some disabled people feeling more nervous about declaring their disability because of being afraid of discrimination or victimisation or harassment. You know, austere times can sometimes mean that people behave in a not very nice way to people who they may see as benefits, cheats or whatever. So there's that. It's a broader societal issue as a backdrop, could possibly be having some kind of influence as well, and that's fairly widely reported, that there are more of these fears over the last couple of years or so. So a whole range of factors. Also, of course, disability impairments can change. So for people with long-term limiting illnesses, they may go into remission, choose not to identify, whereas you know, a year ago they might have identified. So yes, a very personal issue, and it can mean a number of different things.
Right. Thank you. Do we have a final question? Or no? If not, then you will have a chance to talk to Amanda during the coffee break. Thank you very much.
Thank you, pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.